I'm excited about this talk by Luisa Paes. Luisa Paes. She's part of ARVORE, which is a phenomenal company. If you haven't been following it, they've made some really fun games, and I've been following them from day one. I've had a pleasure to collaborate on some of the cool content that they've been building with some of the social things, and just always amazed by the cutting edge content that they're pushing. So without further ado, please, Luisa, I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to present.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you for joining me here today. We're going to be talking a little bit about narrative design for XR games. And I don't intend to fully cover what there is to cover when it comes to narrative design because, it involves both narrative and design. Those are two things that have been studied and talked about and analyzed for decades, and who am I with my 20 minutes to fully cover what it could be? So I'll just try to give a very brief overview so that you get curious enough to actually look for some keywords online and maybe talk to me later about it. Okay, so this is me. If you guys couldn't tell, that's the same person. And my name is Luisa. I'm a narrative designer and game writer from São Paulo, Brazil. I've been working on, for the last 2 years, on a game called Pixel Ripped 1978, which is a part of the Pixel Ripped game franchise, and as created by Ana Ribeiro. And this particular episode is going to be published by Atari. The studio that does Pixel Ripped is ARVORE, or ARVORE, as you say, with an American accent, which is pretty interesting because it takes a completely different meaning. Hopefully you don't think about vor when reading it, but I'm getting off track. We're actually pretty successful with narrative experiences, narrative games. We have some pretty serious laureates here that can attest to that. We've worked with The Line, we've created The Line, we've created Yuki, and I'm actually going to use them as examples by the end of this conversation. Okay, so let's start with some narrative definitions. I've put here 2 definitions that I like, especially because they're pretty straightforward. The first one by Porter Abbott. The takeaway here is that if story is an end, narrative is the means to. Again, this is a metaphor crafted by myself, so don't take my word for it, take their word for it. And Marie-Laure Ryan here says that narrative is a combination of story and discourse, just like Porter Abbott said. But the main point here is that the difference between narrative and any other type of discourse, text type, media, is that it invokes stories in people's minds. So narrative is a way of telling a story. So with that, what is narrative design? My good friend Mariana Brecht, which worked on The Line, said that narrative design is an alignment. And I especially like that because, creating games is something you do usually, not always, but usually with more than one people, with more than one sector of creating games, with art, with narrative, with game design. Everyone involved in that has to be aligned into what the narrative is, what the message you're trying to convey is. So it is a work done in community, and that's what I like about this definition. The other definition by Kathleen Tremblay, it's important because it reminds us of something that we sometimes forget, which is narrative design is game design. So if you're creating games, you're designing games, one subsection of game design is narrative design. And this will be important later on as I show more and more slides to you. So keep it in mind, I'm foreshadowing a little bit. So remember that narrative design is game design. Yeah, that. So how can narrative help my game? Let's say you're a very pragmatic person and you have to have a reason to tell stories. You know, you forget sometimes that you're human. Human likes telling stories. And you say, why would I add that to my game? I just like, shooting at things. And you can do that with narrative. There's this book I've been reading called Slay the Dragon. It's about video game writing. And the authors say that if a story is a journey of emotions, a game is a journey of actions. So if you're good in math, you can kind of do the equation here and say that if I add a story to my game, I turn the actions into something that are emotional. I get an emotional response from the player. The actions become charged because they're emotionally involved with what they're doing, with the character they're playing as. That's important in itself, but it also helps with game comprehension. So let's say you're playing chess and you just have, these little figurines that are either black or white. If you give them a tiny detail, a tiny backstory, if you will, the rules in chess are easier to comprehend. Not easy because they never are, chess, right? But easier. So, a horse does that, knight does that, a pawn does that, so forth and so forth. You keep a player engaged until the end of the game. They want to know what happens at the end, even if it's their own emotional response to the game, their own emergent narrative, if you will. It doesn't have to be a traditional story with a beginning, middle, and end. It can be their own story with that character. So if they feel that way, they want to know what happens until the end. And with multiplayer games, adding a story, a narrative, backstory, lore, if you will, adds with the sense of belonging, of community building. Even if they can't really tell all the details in the story you crafted, they have a reaction, an emotional reaction to the friends they made when they were playing your game. So, you want to start thinking about narrative. What is the first thing you should do? You should start collecting references and tools. I've put here some pretty basic ones, and there's a mixture of pretty much everything. Of course, I did some self-praise. I've put the line over there. But here are some books, tools, and games that you can start collecting to have reference to start working narrative in your own game or your own immersive experience. You can read books, you can play games, you can watch people playing games. Actually, half of my references aren't of games I've played. They're actually of games I've watched people play. And of course, you can use tools like Miro and Twine to help craft your first linear progression of story and write down your first ideas. It doesn't have to be anything like that. It could be just a book, a notebook, a pen, and some iced tea or coffee if you're that type of person. Well, if I've equipped my items, can I use pretty much anything in regards to narrative to study it? Sorta. This very complex graph here shows that you could use film studies or book studies or films and books and TV shows to study narrative for your games, but you have to keep in mind there's something really different about them. And all of you probably know, I'm not, saying something extremely complex and like the graph here. But interactivity is the main difference. You have to keep in mind that unlike books and like movies, the player interacts. And again, this might sound pretty obvious, but it comes in hand when you're trying to create this intricate, complicated story, and it's really close to your heart. And you forget that you're not the one experiencing it. Another person is. And they might completely ignore all the things you hold dear to your heart just because you've put a dog NPC somewhere and they really want to pet it. So you have to keep that in mind, that sometimes your story is not going to be perceived how you wanted it. That's why narrative design can help. So have that in mind when going to the bookstore and getting all the narrative blank books you find to study. They don't usually have anything about interactivity. So, remember when I foreshadowed that game design is narrative design? And I hope you do, because that was like 5 minutes ago, and if you don't, I don't know, maybe check with your doctor. I'm being very passive-aggressive with that, sorry. Hopefully you remember that narrative design is game design. And if you also again with maths, this is a very mathematical talk. If you remember that interactivity is something that makes narrative design for games completely different from other types of media, you have the result that the player should be at the center of your work. Again, if you're writing a book by yourself, you don't have to put the reader at the center of your work. You can do it because you want to tell your story, regardless of who it is. You can do that with games, but you have to realize that people are going to interact with it, with your narrative, with your story. Narrative design is game design. If game design puts the player in the middle of everything, so should narrative design. You're doing the whole thing so they can enjoy the game they're playing that you crafted, and get an emotional response out of it. That's why you're crafting this in the first place. So it should be, their little center of the world. So this is, the basis for the very deep narrative theory about it. Now let's go to some day-to-day narrative design. This right here are the 5 different types of jobs you can have inside narrative design. The first one is the game narrative designer. So basically the lead narrative designer, if you will, the narrative director sometimes. This is the person that keeps the overview of the game's story and narrative and linear progression in mind. This is the boss in its own way. Then you have the game writer. This is very similar to the screenwriter in film and television. It's the person that actually writes a script and writes the game dialogue. It doesn't have to look like a traditional script done in a software for film, but it is the person that does the written story part and writes the dialogue down. The UX writer, the user experience writer, also does the writing, but for interfaces and tutorials. So they have to keep in mind that the player can't be lost. And narrative design, as I said, really helps with tutorials. People have to know what they're doing. And sometimes it's in text form, and that's what the UX writer is for, but sometimes it's just a good old solid design. Then we have the game copywriter, and this person does social media and call to actions. These are the people who make everything more interesting outside the game itself. And last but not least, the localization specialist, the person who translates everything to other languages so that players from other parts of the world can understand your game and also don't get anything lost in translation. There you go. That was almost lost in translation. So, for more fancy graphs, how do you make that happen? How does one go about doing the 5 different types of narrative design that I showed you? Well, you're right. If that's not obvious, you do a lot of writing. You also doctor a lot of writing. You have to read other people's writing, especially if you're a lead narrative designer, because you're not going to be doing all the writing yourself. You have to, read other people's stuff. You use tools and you create tools, and you also go to events like this. You study, interact with peers. And I've added this tool right here that we created at ARVORE, and it doesn't look like that nowadays, but I like the colors in it. Sometimes narrative design is purely visual. So this is our Hive framework, and basically it's just a way of making a lot of written down portions a little more visible. Because, as I said, narrative design is something you create in community. So if you have to show your lead artist a block of text that you've written down with a lot of backstory, they, might not like it. Understandable. I don't know why. I really like words, but some people don't. So we've created a graph with colors, and that makes people happy. I'm happy with just by looking at it, and I've made it too. So what about XR? Well, again, with some obvious moments, bear with me here, the player has more agency. So if the player has agency in any game, with XR, we're giving them full reign. Remember what I said about ignoring the large chunk of backstory you're feeding the player because there's a dog? That really, really happens in XR. They completely miss what you're showing them because there's a dog. Could be a fish. If you're a cat person, sometimes it's a cat. The body is at play, so you have to consider that the person is going to have some range of movement. Even if they're sitting down, they have full range of their arms and sometimes even their gaze at the very least. And talking about gaze, I have this thing that I sometimes feel like narrative design for XR games gets a little similar to film in a way that the director and the director of photography controls the gaze of someone who's watching a film. They show what's interesting to them, sometimes pretty obviously, sometimes with just, a nice camera focus, some colors, things like that. That's not completely different from XR, it's just that in XR it's completely on steroids. You have to make it interesting because the person might completely miss it. So if you can't use fancy camera angles or, fireworks, if you're Michael Bay, you have to think of something else. You have to think of something that controls their vision. It's also important to note that if you're thinking about creating narrative for an XR game, you have to add some good OVRness to it. They have to interact with things. People like picking things up when they're in XR. It's the first thing they do. You have to make affordances, interactivity. You also have to keep in mind they have to not only feel immersed by the world you're crafting, they have to feel present. So it's easy, sort of, to create a place where the person's completely immersed, 360, but they're thinking of something else. It's not really fun. They have to be present. They have to really believe the illusion. And of course, XR is still a learning language. We're here to discuss and to learn, and you might completely disagree with me. If you do, please don't let me know. I have very low self-esteem. So adding all that, we get that text and game design form the narrative systems, and that together with creative direction, we decide where narrative design should head inside a game. The parts in yellow here, I don't know if, it's pretty yellow. Okay, that's good. The parts in yellow here are things that you should consider if you're doing an XR game specifically. So I've added inputs, gestures, affordances, interface, directing the gaze, and just like film, under creative direction, you have direction of gaze. Let's go for some examples. Let's really market the heck out of the games I've worked in. This is Pixel Rip 1978, and I want to show you in here that even though it's a pretty wacky adventure through time and space, there's graphs, there's boards, there's scripts. We really kept it traditional sometimes with narrative design for such a wacky adventure. That means that if it keeps you on your toes in regards to not losing track of an intricate, complicated story you're creating, you should go traditional. The important thing here is to get your message across and, of course, show your peers, people that are in your team, the way to go when it comes to your story. And sometimes I had to do that through diagrams in Miro. Not very complicated, not very fancy, but pretty visual, and it works. So, and this is, the GIF I'm showing is like I'm actually working at the same time I'm screen capping it. But these are some of the graphs I created. This is the localization document. Everything, all languages are showing just one Excel sheet. And then we have my actual script, which is, again, very straightforward, very traditional. If you've ever seen a film script, that's exactly what it looks like. It's just that the content is completely different. Now, let's move on to Yuki. Yuki doesn't have a traditional story in the sense that it's not written. You're not reading huge block of texts in Yuki. Yuki's a roguelite bullet hell adventure in space. And it had one of its design pillars, one of its main focus was that you have to keep the fantasy alive, the core fantasy. That's what we call it. You have to really not only enjoy the gameplay we crafted, but truly believe and truly feel immersed and present in this crazy journey through space. So for that to start, for that to really begin its ascent when you're playing, you have to start in Kimi's room. Kimi is the little girl character you control when you start playing with Yuki, the character that was just on the slide previously. So for that, we had a really deep study on how her room could look so that you felt that sense of being a kid again. And then you start playing with your toys, and then that playing with your toys actually becomes a intense, full of yoke-aliens, we call them, and shootout that you're in the middle of. It starts with just being a kid again in your room, and having different posters, having your notebooks, having your toys. There's a fish in there. A lot of people love the fish. Wasn't really what we planned for, but apparently animals are a thing in VR. And it got to a point where one of our testers actually thought Yuki was an anime that existed because it felt so believable. That's part of narrative design as well. So when it came time to do Yuki MR, which, you know, is a different type of language in regards to VR, we had to do something to make it interesting without using, again, huge blocks of text, especially because it's MR. You're starting off at the person playing own room. They're in their house. How immersed they can start feeling when they're in a place they know. They're not in Kimi's room anymore. We wanted to add then a wow factor, so something that really made the ice pop and the person realized that, whoa, I'm not in my room anymore. They don't even think that when they reach the end of the game. So that starts with a curve, right? And it's a crescendo, if you will. So we have here a somewhat storyboard of our creative director of how you start in your own room. It has little holes popping up, so you're breaching the person's place, and by the end, it's not their place anymore. You've been growing and growing, and the gameplay becomes harder and harder, and by the time you reach the end, you've completely immersed into something else, and you didn't even realize it. So that's the wow factor. You got surprised. You didn't see that happen because you were so engrossed into gameplay. And so that's a little bit of the planning we did. It starts like that, with that beautiful drawing, and becomes an actual part of gameplay. So it's a lot. It's basically a lot. I tried to cover everything in just some minutes, but pretty much every slide is a speech or a talk in itself. This other very complicated, extremely intricate graph here shows that the player is the center of all of our thoughts, right? So animation, sound, gameplay, everyone has to keep the player in mind. And narrative covers everything. The artist has to represent narrative in some way. The programmer has to represent it in some way. Of course, text has to represent it, but it's not only text. With the examples I've shown in Yuki, you've seen things that aren't written down anywhere. They were drawn, and they were narrative thoughts. So I think that's a wrap. Thank you, everyone, and thank you for my colleagues in ARVORE as well. I think we have time for questions.
Thank you, Celine Tricart, game director. Thank you so much. You really did a good job at explaining how the player is at the center of everything and how XR differs from maybe traditional video games. Can you maybe give us some concrete example on how in one of your projects, being first person to a huge degree in VR has affected your narrative design versus controlling a character in front of a TV, for example? Like, how does the player itself, himself, herself, is a part of the narrative more in VR than other mediums?
Personally, I like to feed everything that's important for the player to understand the main. So in Pixel Rip, right? There's a linear story, beginning, middle, and end. Anything pertaining to that linear story, so important characters, important moments in time, even important gameplay, I really want to keep it somewhat traditional so that the person doesn't miss it. They don't have a choice, especially because it's a game aimed to pretty much everybody that has nostalgic feelings towards games. I really don't want to turn anyone away from what we're showing. So if we have to keep it traditional in the sense that visual storytelling is a little more obvious with colors and with object location, if the NPC has to be a little more straightforward with how they talk, and something we used in Pixar of 1978, which was really successful, and it's completely the job of our amazing UX designer, is that rich text, again, obvious, but really helps when you're trying to feed a small block of text that has a lot of information. So sometimes traditional things can work in XR, especially if you're feeding a traditional story. If you're not, you have to really, personally, you have to keep the message, the core message in mind, right? So if you feel like visual storytelling helps your message more, if you want the person to interpret it and feel it a little more in their heart visually, then you completely ignore text and you go with gaze directing. And again, this is where everyone in the team helps with, should I make this object a little more obvious, a little more colorful? Should we place it a little closer? Should we use UI and UX feedbacks on the object? I know it's not fancy and it's not the chic answer to give, but sometimes it's necessary. The important thing is that everything you want to feed your player in regards to your message isn't missed. So it's really a group effort.
So first of all, great presentation. I wanted to ask, like, your game Yuki, for example, it seems like it has a VR element and a narrative element and then gameplay as well. So gameplay is, traditionally more dexterous, like you're doing stuff and getting the audio-visual feedback, the reward there. Versus the narrative, you kind of have to, like, chill out a little bit. You don't have to do so much or time anything. So how do you reconcile those two different modalities that the player experiences? Because they're quite different, and I think it's very hard to actually make those coexist in an experience.
So that's what curves are pretty interesting, because you have to time your curves. So again, if you're playing a bullet hell game like Yuki is, game designers are going to say, look, we're going to start softly, and then we are going to put an enemy here, a mini boss here. By the end, we want to raise this false sense of tranquility, and then we have a boss. They're going to do that. It's game design. They're definitely going through it. As a narrative designer, you have to pick this curve, this planning that they did, and say, look, if I want to feed information, I have to time my information. And again, it doesn't have to be literal information. It can be an emotional response. If I want to add an emotional response in this particular mission, I have to time it in the way that gameplay doesn't get in the way, it only helps. So say, I want to make the player feel calm before the boss, to have this false sense of tranquility. Then the game designer is going to add less enemies, and you're going to talk to your artist to say, look, use a bluer color here, because it helps with people getting calmer. Let's put some flowers, because people might think they're entering a calm place. Let's have the NPC character say hi, appear for some reason. Everything helps with adding that sense of tranquility, and then you really hype it up. So it's a similar answer in the sense that it has to be a group effort. You have to pick this curve, and they really help, tear it apart, and time your narrative moments, while not forgetting that narrative happens all the time. So even if gameplay is running crazy, it's chaos, it's bullets coming from everywhere, you have to keep that in mind, that narrative doesn't stop. So the ambient you're playing is being considered. What type of enemies, and what are they wearing, and do they have a backstory or not?
Well, all right. Thank you so much. That was a fantastic talk. And please, everyone, come in. There's plenty of seats.